Hello and welcome to The View from Mayor Brown podcast. This is a fortnightly podcast series for employment lawyers and HR practitioners which highlights developments in case law and legislative changes of importance to UK employers. It's presented by Nicholas Robertson, the head of Mayor Brown's London employment team. This podcast is available via iTunes, YouTube and the Twitter feed Nicholas Robertson, Twitter handle @NicholasRobert11. It is also now available on Spotify, Google Play and Yahoo. The time spent listening to these podcasts can count towards your continuing education requirements. And at the end of the podcast, we will explain how to get in touch if you wish to claim credit for continuing education purposes or if you have any comments or questions.
Hello and welcome to podcast number 179. I hope everyone's been keeping well and safe. Reason for doing the podcast is, it must be at least 10 days since I did a podcast on the coronavirus update, guidance alert, furlough scheme thing, etc. Well, the end of last week we had an update to the Treasury direction. Sadly, my attempt to call my first update One Direction fell. It was vetoed, so I can't call this Two Direction. I hope everyone gets the joke. Anyway, we've got a new direction, and it makes a number of changes to the previous direction. The changes are, let's be honest, for the most part, quite helpful. But they do make a number of significant alterations to the rules as we previously understood them. Indeed, I think the first point to note about the direction is that it raises the possibility that there are going to be multiple directions applicable depending on the period for which the employer is submitting the claim. This direction applies up until the end of July 2020. But according to Section 16, it accepts pretty much implicitly that it is taking a different approach to the first direction, the 15th April direction. As such, this second direction applies automatically to any claims submitted by an employer under the furlough scheme after the date of publication, which, as I say, is Wednesday 20th May, although it went live a couple of days later. But in respect to claims submitted before that date, employers effectively get a second bite of the cherry. A claim under the government furlough scheme submitted prior to 20th May 2020 will be valid either if it is valid under the direction/guidance notes at that time, or, by fluke, it is compliant with the direction applying from 20th May onwards. So either route will get you home. Obviously, after 20th of May, the only game in town is the new direction and supplemented by the guidance notes. Well, so what's changed? Well, the first thing to note is the direction attempts to look at the issue of whether employers can furlough staff who are sick at the point at which they were furloughed. This is obviously critical importance given the number of people who are potentially affected by the pandemic. And we, employment lawyers, employers, had generally struggled to understand what was a clear disparity between the government's furlough guidance notes and the direction as originally published. The guidance notes, just to be clear, the guidance notes said and still say, quote, "Short-term illness/self-isolation should not be a consideration in deciding whether to furlough an employee. If, however, employers want to furlough employees for business reasons, and they are currently off sick, they are eligible to do so as with other employees. In these cases, the employee should no longer receive sick pay and will be classified as a furloughed employee." Unquote. So, clear, you can furlough sick employees. The direction, in its original format, said precisely the opposite. HMRC, and adopting a sort of Alice in Wonderland approach to the English language, refused to accept there was any inconsistency between the direction and the guidance, which, as I say, strained credulity. Well, anyway, in the latest iteration of the direction, this section has now been updated, so it provides, quote, "Where statutory sick pay is in payment or due to be paid in respect of an employee at the time when the instruction is given," pausing, i.e. the instruction to go on furlough, then the furlough period, quote, "does not begin until immediately after the end of the period of incapacity for work for which the statutory sick pay is in payment or due to be paid," and now comes the important part, "provided that the time of the end of that period of incapacity for work is determined by an agreement between the employer and employee," unquote. So just that last bit again, provided the time of the end of that period of incapacity for work is determined by an agreement between the employer and employee. This is pretty opaque on first reading, but I think it means that the HMRC is moving to narrow the gap between the direction and the guidance note. It appears that an employer and employee can agree that an employee will come off sick leave and be treated as being on furlough from that point on. We'll look below at what the current direction says about the need for consent before an individual is furloughed, but as a matter of logic, if an individual is entitled to sick pay, there's nothing particularly surprising in the government saying that the individual should have to give their consent before being moved off sick pay onto the furlough scheme. Otherwise, the reference to the agreement of the employee to ending the period of sick leave makes no sense. Individuals end their period of sick leave when, as a matter of fact, they've recovered sufficiently to be able to return to work. And obviously, once they're no longer sick, then the ordinary rules on furlough would apply to them. Their agreement, to that extent, isn't any different from any other employee. However, if the reference to an agreement is understood to mean an agreement to move an employee who is otherwise eligible to remain on statutory sick pay onto the furlough scheme, then, well, it becomes clearer. The scope of work which can be undertaken by individuals who are on furlough has also been clarified. There are 3 basic situations where we now have further guidance. 1. We've known for some time that company directors can be put on furlough, but the direction confirms that it's permissible for directors to be involved in filing the furlough claim on behalf of their company without, in some ironic way, rendering themselves ineligible for the furlough scheme. Similarly, if the director is involved in making payment of wages to employees, that does not take the director outside the furlough scheme. Secondly, employees who are pension trustees can now carry out duties without being in breach of the furlough scheme, and this applies provided the work undertaken by the furloughed employee is for the, quote, sole purpose, unquote, of fulfilling their duties as a trustee or manager of the pension scheme. It doesn't apply to independent trustees of the scheme carrying out their duties. Finally, there's extended guidance on the sort of training and study that can be done by an employee on furlough without rendering themselves ineligible. If the study is for the purpose of improving the, quote, employee's effectiveness in the employer's business or the performance of the employer's business, then that is permitted explicitly. Presumably the concern was that the more directly the training related to the employer's business, then the danger it might be seen as providing a service to the employer or undertaking business activities of the employer, which, as you remember, is the general prohibition. That's what you can't do under the furlough scheme. But as I say, this sort of training is now expressly permitted. Otherwise, any type of training is permitted provided it is not directly providing a service to the employer or its business activities, or contributing to the business activities of the employer, or generating income or profit for the employer. Also, it mustn't contribute to any significant degree in the production of goods that the employer intends to supply or the supply of services. Well, we've also got a further rules on the sort of payments which are capable of being included in any calculation of sums reclaimable under the furlough scheme. It's a bit of a mess, if I'm honest, and it sort of needs to go through 3 stages. You can, but you can't, but then you can again. Let me make that good. Okay, basic rule, is that the only payments which can be included in a claim under the furlough scheme are those which are, quote, regular salary or wages, unquote. An employer cannot claim for the costs of providing anything in respect of benefits in kind or anything provided or made available in lieu of a cash payment. This includes salary sacrifice schemes. A payment is a regular payment of salary and wages if it is paid according to a legally enforceable agreement, and it cannot vary according to a, quote, relevant matter, unquote, save where the payment, which is variable, is a non-discretionary payment, quote, unquote. So if it's a relevant matter, that's bad, but a relevant matter that is a non-discretionary payment is okay. That's what I mean. You're in, but you're out, but you're in again. So the list of relevant matters, which takes the payments outside the scope of the scheme, hasn't changed. Payments which vary according to the performance of the business or any part of it, or by the contribution made by the employee to the performance of the business, or the performance by the employee of any duties of employment, or any similar considerations, or that are otherwise payable at the discretion of the employer, are generally not permitted. But they are permitted if the payment is not a discretionary one and is in respect of overtime, fees, commission, piece rate, is made in recognition of the employee undertaking additional or exceptional responsibilities, or is made in recognition of the circumstances in which the employee undertakes the employee's duties or the time when they are undertaken. So there's then a general provision that says payments which are in recognition of matters analogous to this list may also be included within the furlough scheme calculations. So I think if you try and boil this down, we've got a more detailed statement that essentially says Non-variable payments which the employer is obliged to pay can be included. Variable payments, such as overtime shift allowances, sales bonuses, London waiting allowance, can be paid, provided they are contractual and not discretionary. And finally, we come to the issue of consent. It's been a bone of contention for employers that HMRC and the furlough guidance notes did not exactly speak with one voice. Was it necessary for the employee to consent specifically to being furloughed? If an employee furloughed an employee without consent but relying on general power under the contract, or it was a reasonable business instruction, was that invalid for the purposes of the furlough scheme? There are millions, if not billions of pounds resting on the answer to that question. So it's therefore frustrating that the disparity between the guidance note and the direction went uncorrected. However, the good news is we've got some progress. We've got some clarity. And it's probably worth just working our way through this in stages. The guidance note provides, employers should discuss with their staff and make any changes to the employment contract by agreement. When employers are making decisions in relation to the process, including deciding who to offer furlough to, equality and discrimination laws will apply in the usual way. To be eligible for the grant, employers must confirm in writing to their employee, confirming that they have been furloughed. Unquote. Ignore the terrible English in that sentence, that's the way it's written. Anyway, back into the quote. If this is done in a way that is consistent with employment law, that consent is valid for the purpose of claiming through the scheme. Collective agreement reached between employer and trade union is also acceptable for the purpose of such claim. There needs to be a written record, but the employee does not need to have provided a written response. A record of the communication must be kept for 5 years. Unquote. So, employers must confirm it in writing. If this is done in a way that is consistent with employment law, that consent is valid for the purpose of claiming through the scheme. That's the key part. So, is the instruction valid? By contrast, the direction originally provided the employer and employee had to have, quote, agreed in writing, unquote, that the individual will be furloughed. Now, helpfully, that direction wording has now been dropped. The direction now says that, the direction has said for a while that the employee needs to be instructed by the employer to cease all work in relation to their employment. The definition of what it means to be instructed by the employer to cease all work has been revised. That's in section 6.7. This section now says, an employee has been instructed by the employer to cease all work in relation to their employment only if the employer and employee have agreed that the employee will cease all work in relation to their employment, brackets, such agreement may be made by means of a collective agreement between the employer and the trade union, brackets, and the agreement specifies the main terms and conditions upon which the employee will cease all work in relation to their employment, and is incorporated expressly or impliedly into the employee's contract, and is made in writing or confirmed in writing by the employer. Such agreement may be made in an electronic form, such as an email. In line with the guidance, unquote, I should say, in line with the guidance, the relevant document needs to be kept until 30th June 2025. So, from this we can see that any requirement in the first direction that the employee has agreed in writing to being furloughed has now been dropped. That's completely gone. The employer and employee have to have agreed that the individual will be furloughed, but the revised wording does seem to leave it open to the employer to say that the instruction to furlough the employee was based on the pre-existing contract of employment, or was a reasonable instruction given under that contract, and therefore agreement was obtained when the individual signed up to the contract giving the employer the power to make the reasonable instruction. It would seem likely that the new requirement that the written document, quote, specifies the main terms and conditions upon which the employee will cease all work, unquote. It's going to be a pretty light touch. An employee who's been furloughed on full pay with no other terms and conditions changing will probably have the simplest of letters, merely recording that the other terms are ongoing but they are to be furloughed, or simply saying they are to be furloughed and making no other reference to any changes from which it is implicit that the other terms continue unchanged. There may be some further detail to be put in relation to an employee who has agreed to accept a pay cut during the furlough period. Equally, it's likely that the letter instructing the individual to do things which amount to a variation of the contract will be taken to be incorporated expressly or impliedly into the contract. I think it's highly unlikely that any employers will have furloughed individuals with letters which expressly stated that the letter did not form part of the contract. So, although the guidance note does not exactly close the door on the argument the employee had to agree to being furloughed explicitly and relying on a prior contractual term or a reasonable instruction is sufficient, it's probably moving in that direction, the direction that employers would want, the direction that allows an employer to say either I gave reasonable instruction, or there was a power under the contract, or the employee accepted it by their actions and accepted pay during the furlough period without protest, from which they can be taken to have implicitly consented. Remember, of course, that the guidance notes continue to say, and have said for a long time, unequivocally, that if the instruction to go on furlough is, quote, done in a way that is consistent with employment law, then consent is valid for the purpose of claiming through the scheme, unquote. This means that provided the instruction was neither a breach of contract nor was objected to by the employee at the time, so the employer can't rely on the waiver or consent argument by action, then employers, I think, can rest pretty easy on this issue. Probably. Or until the third direction comes along and changes our understanding again. Anyway, given that it's now, I'm recording this on Friday the 29th of May, and based on past practice, I fully expect that Rishi Sunak will put out an announcement today about the tapering of the furlough scheme. He is doing a podcast early next week on the new direction, the third direction, or the guidance update that we have on what is going to happen with the furlough scheme. So, that's podcast 179. Thank you very much for listening. I am happy to confirm that absolutely none of this podcast was recorded at Barnard Castle. Thanks very much.
So that concludes this podcast. We hope that you find it and others in the series helpful. If you have any comments or questions or want to know how to claim continuing education credits, please email Nick at nrobertson@mayorbrown.com. Thank you for listening to the podcast.